The German sniper had been in that farmhouse window since before dawn. His face was covered in ash, a trick he'd learned on the Eastern Front. He'd been motionless for 6 hours. The only thing that moved was his finger, resting on the trigger of his Kar 98K. He could see the American patrol before they could see him. He had killed 30 men from positions like this. He was invisible. He was patient. And he was already dead. The man who killed him wasn't a sniper. He was a farm boy from Kentucky who had never fired a scoped rifle in his life. He wasn't hunting the sniper. He was hunting dinner. The German snipers' training had a blind spot, and that blind spot cost them the war in the hedgerows. The Germans didn't become deadly snipers overnight. They became deadly because they had to. On the Eastern Front, the war was brutal in a way the West never was. The Soviets didn't just fight back. They fought with a fury that forced the Germans to adapt, to innovate, or to die. And the men who survived that adaptation became something the world had never seen. By 1943, the German sniper program was the most sophisticated on the planet. They had training depots tucked into the foothills of the Austrian Alps, where instructors who had survived years of stalking Soviets across Ukraine and the frozen wastes north of Leningrad passed on everything they had learned. They built miniature landscapes, complete with villages and roads, where students shot at enemy figures that appeared briefly in windows, doorways, and behind trees. The targets moved on ropes. The instructors constantly rebuilt the terrain to make each exercise harder than the last. The curriculum was ruthless. Every graduate had to hit a small target without fail at 325 to 435 yards. They were taught patience above all else, how to lie motionless for hours, how to read the wind, how to estimate distance with nothing but their eyes. They were taught camouflage, the art of disappearing into the landscape with portable hides made of branches and brush. They were taught to use dummies on ropes to draw enemy fire. But there was something else. Something so deeply embedded in the training that no one ever wrote it down as a separate lesson. They were taught how to think like the enemy marksmen. This was the entire logic of the Eastern Front. If you were a German sharpshooter, your most dangerous enemy wasn't a Soviet infantryman. It was another specialist. A man in a hide across a smashed street in Stalingrad, a woman in a tree line outside Kursk, somebody who thought the same way you did, saw terrain the same way you did, had learned by staying alive that this bush is too obvious and that window is too dark and that ledge is where an eye would go first. Every German training exercise at its core was an exercise in mirror thinking. Where would he hide? Where would he shoot from? What position would draw his fire first? The Germans got very good at this. So good that even British sniper reports from Normandy described them as quite exceptional in their ability to remain concealed while identifying and engaging targets at ranges up to 1,000 meters. The system worked. It worked because the Soviets were building an identical system. Vasily Zaitsev, the most famous Soviet marksman, had been a hunter of wolves in the Ural Mountains before the war. When he stalked Germans in the ruins of Stalingrad, he was doing something he had done all his life. A hunter looking for another hunter. The Germans and the Soviets fought a 2-year duel in which both sides thought the same thoughts about the same terrain. And that was the assumption buried at the heart of every German training exercise. They were not building marksmen who could kill any enemy. They were building marksmen who could kill an enemy who thought like a marksman. The whole curriculum assumed that the man on the other side of the field would ask the same question. Where is the shooter? How does he see me? For the Germans, this was not a bug. It was the entire foundation of their success. Matthias Hetzenaw, the highest-scoring Axis sniper, racked up 345 confirmed kills using this system. Sepp Allerberger, the second most successful sniper in the Wehrmacht, had 257. These men weren't lucky. They were the product of a systematic pedagogy that understood the sniper duel down to its finest details. But that pedagogy had a gap in it that nobody in Berlin ever noticed. It had never taught what to do when the enemy was not another sniper. It had never taught what to do when the enemy was essentially a whole country of hunters who had grown up thinking about being the hunted rather than about doing the hunting. In June of 1944, the machine that had been perfected against Soviet aces was moved to the west. And it met, for the first time in years of war, an opponent who was not playing the same game at all. So who was this ordinary soldier the Germans were about to meet? On paper, he was nothing special. He had gone through basic training, about 8 weeks of general military instruction at places like Fort Benning or Camp Walters. He had shot on the rifle range. He had learned to keep his weapon clean. He had drilled on formations, small unit tactics, first aid. Then he'd been shipped to a specialized training unit, then to an overseas replacement depot, and eventually to a unit somewhere in Europe, often as a green replacement for a man who had just been killed. He was not a hunter of men. The army had made almost no attempt to teach him to be one. There was no formal American sniper program to speak of. A few units did some isolated training. Photographs survive of soldiers in Puerto Rico climbing palm trees with pole climbers, learning to hide in the fronds. But this was the exception, not the rule. The U.S. Army Sniper School wasn't established until 1987, an explicit recognition of a gap that had lasted more than 4 decades. In 1944, the American infantryman was, by every measure, an amateur when it came to the specialized art of sharpshooting. But here's the thing about amateurs. Sometimes they bring something to the fight that professionals never learned. The American infantryman of 1944 was statistically a rural boy. In 1940, the census recorded that roughly 43% of the American population lived in rural areas, on farms, in small towns, in unincorporated communities where the nearest neighbor might be a half-mile down a dirt road. Rifle ownership in that world wasn't political the way it is today. It was practical. A firearm was how you kept coyotes off the chickens. A firearm was how you got venison in November when the meat had to last the winter. A firearm was a tool your father had shown you how to use when you were 9 or 10 years old. By 16, you could hit a rabbit at 70 yards from a standing position without particularly thinking about it. 1 rabbit, 1 shot. 1 squirrel, 1 shot. 1 deer, 1 shot. You grew up poor and hungry, and you learned to make every round count. The army didn't have to teach these boys to shoot. It had to teach them to shoot within a system, to fire on command, to hold fire until commanded, to work with a squad. But the raw material of marksmanship was already there. When American Rifleman magazine visited the First Army in Normandy in July 1944, the correspondent wrote about men he'd interviewed. Men who had been shooting since childhood, whose scores were mounting steadily as they picked German soldiers out of the hedges. These men were not products of an official school. They were rural marksmen who had been extraordinary shots since childhood, and the army had simply given them a task. But here's what the Germans never anticipated. Shooting was not the important thing. Shooting was what the Germans expected. What they did not expect was what the rural boys had been doing since they were small. They had been sitting in tree stands watching for deer. They had been walking creek beds, looking for turkey. They had spent hundreds of hours, not tactical hours, not military hours, but hours as a child, hours as a teenager, reading terrain from the perspective of the animal being hunted. Where does a deer bed down for the night? A deer beds down where it can see 2 directions and cannot be approached from behind. Where does a rabbit hide? Where the brush is thick and the ground is close. Where does a fox den? Where the wind carries approach smells away. None of this was military training. All of it was a form of terrain reading that came from the opposite side of the encounter. The hunter of animals is not thinking like a shooter. He's thinking like the animal. He is asking, what would I do if I were the thing being hunted? Where would I be if I wanted to see without being seen? This is a different question from the one the German specialist asks. The German asks, where do I shoot from? The American rural boy, without even naming what he was doing, was asking, where would I hide? That is defender's thinking, and it produced very different answers about the same piece of ground. Consider a Norman hedgerow. The German sharpshooter, thinking as an offensive shooter, evaluates it for fields of fire. Can I engage a road? Can I engage a field crossing? What is my exit route? He selects a position, often brilliantly, that gives him a wide arc of fire and multiple ways out. Now imagine the American soldier looking at the same hedgerow. He is not asking where he would shoot from. He is asking, if a shooter were hiding here, where would he be? And his answer is not a hunter's answer. It is a hider's answer. It is the answer of a boy who spent years being invisible to deer. The German position, carefully selected, obvious to another sniper as a killing spot, was often equally obvious to an American who had spent his childhood being still. By late June of 1944, American units were still taking sniper casualties. But something was changing about how they responded. And here is the point that would have terrified the Germans if they had understood it. The men who were finding them were not other snipers. They were ordinary riflemen. Farm boys with M1 Garens who had walked into a field, taken one shot, gone to ground, and then, instead of trying to hunt back, had done something the German training had never prepared anyone to defend against. Because the American defender did not hunt the sniper. He held the ground, and he made the sniper's position untenable. That shift, from hunter's game to defender's game, was the beginning of the end. But in the first weeks after D-Day, none of that had happened yet. Because in those first weeks, the Americans weren't thinking like anything. They were dying. At first, the results looked like a total German victory. In the first weeks after D-Day, American units in the Bocage, the ancient hedge country of Normandy, were being systematically picked apart. The Wikipedia summary of the period is, in its rare understatement, this: the U.S. Army's lack of familiarity with sniping tactics proved disastrous in Normandy. American after-action reports from June and early July of 1944 described the same scene over and over. A platoon moves into a field. One man goes down. The rest hit the ground. And then they are eliminated one after another by a single rifle they never see. One German sniper, well-hidden, well-trained, could pin down an entire platoon for hours. He didn't need to kill them all. He just needed to make them afraid to move. And the fear did the rest. Company C of the 26th Infantry Regiment, fighting outside a village called Kumlipa, was locked in what became a 30-day stalemate along a single hedgerow. One GI summary noted flatly, "Could not see the Germans, but the Germans could see them. The only offensive action available was to fire blindly through the hedges, a kind of reconnaissance by desperation. They were shooting at ghosts, and the ghosts were shooting back. This should have been a preview of a long, slow bleeding. Every field costing a squad, every hedgerow costing a lieutenant. If the German sniper program in the West had continued to work the way it had worked in the East, the Normandy campaign might have taken twice as long, and the road to Berlin might have cost the Americans 100,000 additional casualties." Sergeant Russell Wormy knew that cost. He was a company sniper who had learned his trade in Sicily and North Africa, one of the few Americans with any formal experience. But in Normandy, even he was reduced to survival. On June 18, 1944, Wormy was walking down a Norman lane with Privates Delbert Carey and Robert B.R. He remembered opening a gate, walking about 30 yards into what looked like an empty field, and then he caught a movement in his peripheral vision. Just a flicker, just enough. The bullet went through his neck and came out through his back. He survived. Many of his men did not. Wormy later described the war as having been reduced to hearing, walking through sunken lanes, listening for signs of the enemy. The crunch of a boot, the clink of metal, a whisper in a language you didn't understand. That was all you had, because you couldn't see them. The hedgerows were too thick, the fields too open, the positions too well concealed. The German sniper had been trained for this. He had been waiting for this, and for weeks he was winning. But here is what the Germans didn't know. They were winning a battle that was about to become a different kind of war entirely, because something began to shift by mid-July. And by August, the same shooters who had been massacring platoons in June were the ones being hunted through the tree lines. The turning point in Normandy did not have a name. It did not happen on a particular day. No historian has ever singled out the moment when the American infantry stopped being victims of German sharpshooting and started being its executioners. But you can see it happening if you read the divisional after-action reports in sequence. In early June, the reports are grim. By late June, small changes are visible in the paperwork. Company C's patrols are reporting they have heard specific sounds: shovels, voices, footsteps behind hedges, and are relaying coordinates. Engineers are removing anti-personnel mines from trails. Patrols are identifying German positions and calling in mortar fire. The Americans are listening now. They are mapping. They are treating the whole terrain as a defensive problem. What is happening in these reports, though the paperwork does not name it, is that the Americans have stopped trying to play the sharpshooter's game. They are no longer trying to hunt him with another sharpshooter. They are treating him the way you would treat any dangerous animal that keeps threatening your farm. You do not stalk him. You saturate the areas where he lives with something that makes those areas uninhabitable. Mortars, artillery, mass rifle fire, reconnaissance by fire, the deliberate expenditure of rounds into positions that might or might not be occupied. American doctrine had always emphasized firepower, But in the hedgerows, that doctrine collided with a specific problem, and the solution that began to emerge was doctrinally strange and, from the German perspective, almost incomprehensible. The Germans had trained to defeat a hunter, but the Americans were no longer sending hunters. They were sending farmers. This should have been a slow bleeding that cost the Americans 100,000 additional casualties. But that is not what happened. The Americans didn't hunt the sniper. They held the ground, and they made the sniper's position untenable. Think about what a farmer does when a wolf is killing his sheep. He doesn't go into the woods with a rifle and try to outstalk the wolf. He walks the fence lines. He asks, where would the wolf come through? Where does the ground give cover for a big animal? He builds his fences higher there. He sets his dogs to that side of the field at dusk. And when he does hunt the wolf, he brings 4 men, 3 dogs, and a plane. This is defenders' thinking. And it is not an accident that so many American infantrymen fell into it naturally. It was how a large portion of them had grown up thinking about the world. The shift is documented in the correspondence of the period. A First Army report from July 1944, later quoted in American Rifleman magazine, described a change. The tree sniper, a favorite German and Japanese tactic, had already declined in popularity. Why? Because, the report noted plainly, the rifle marksmanship of the Americans has caused a marked decline in the popularity of the tree sniper idea. An American with an M1 Garand, given even a hint of where a shot had come from, could rake a tree with 8 rapid rounds. Then he could reload and rake it again. The Germans stopped climbing trees, not because the trees were bad positions, they were not, but because Americans made them death sentences. The hedgerow was different. It offered more options. And this is where the American defensive mindset produced something the German curriculum could not answer. American commanders had been told in explicit terms in the reports coming out of the beachhead that reinforcement infantry did not know how to do this. Reinforcements have no idea of when to open fire. Reconnaissance by fire is unknown to them. One training assessment noted, they should know when they reach us that it is better to expend ammunition on positions that are not occupied than fail to cover it. Better to waste bullets than to leave a German alive who had watched you walk. That was the operating principle. And if reconnaissance by fire produced any response, a movement, a return shot, a snap twig, the situation escalated instantly. Mortars mounted at platoon and company level went into action within seconds. Artillery, if a forward observer could bring it, followed within minutes. American infantry doctrine at every level, from squad to division, was built around the calling of supporting fire. And the fire was massive. An American mortar section could put a dozen 60mm rounds into 100 square meters of hedgerow before the man who had fired the first shot could realistically move. Sepp Allerberger on the Eastern Front had refined a technique of firing and immediately relocating. It was survivable there because Soviet mortar fire, while dangerous, was not always well coordinated at the tactical level. In the West, the coordination was completely different. American forward observers were embedded down to platoon level. When they called in a target, the response time was often under 2 minutes. A German sharpshooter, having fired his single shot, might not be dead, but he was often trapped. And this is where the German training's assumption began to become a fatal weakness. The Wehrmacht sniper had been taught what to do when confronted by another sniper. He had not been taught what to do when confronted by 3 mortar tubes and a company of angry infantrymen who had watched their sergeant get killed. The Eastern Front had rarely presented that problem. The Western Front presented it constantly. There were men in the American ranks who became known as stalkers. American Rifleman's correspondent, writing from Normandy on July 25, 1944, described them. The specialist, the stalker and scout who goes looking for trouble, and the sniper who waits patiently in an outpost to pick off enemy mortar or artillery observers, outpost guards or machine gun crews. Many of the hero stories being written from here concern the stalkers, men with 20 or 30 Germans to the credit of their stealth and their marksmanship. 20 or 30. Not on a formal sniper school's records because there was no formal sniper school. Not with a special scoped rifle because most did not need one. Just an M1 Garand and a farm boy's understanding of how to disappear. Private first-class register was one of them. American Rifleman told his story that summer. He noticed rustling along a connecting hedgerow, waited, concentrated on that spot, and became certain a German shooter was lying in a ditch on his side of the field. Camouflaged, concealed, and unable to get to the safe side. Register asked an artillery observer to spot for him and fired a single shot. Observation, the correspondent wrote, proved unnecessary. His first shot brought a cry from the ditch, a noticeable movement of a body, and then the long silence. Register had thought like the German. Not the way a sniper thinks like another sniper, like a farmer thinks like a fox. And the fox was in the ditch exactly where a hider would be. And in the ditch was where he died. Staff Sergeant W.L. Michael of Colorado Springs, interviewed for the same magazine, had 5 Germans to his credit. All of them shot out of trees during the earlier advance inland. In one hedgerow engagement, he and his lieutenant were on one side of a hedge, Germans on the other. The lieutenant stood up to throw a grenade in what he thought was the general direction of the enemy. A German officer with a machine pistol fired first. Michael saw the movement in the hedge, fired a quick shot, and killed him. Another German started running beyond the hedge. Michael grabbed the hedge itself, pulled himself up above it, and fired 3 shots, bringing that German down in what his buddies called a fancy piece of shooting. None of this is what German training had prepared for. This was not a sniper duel. This was terrain reading combined with reflexive marksmanship, executed by ordinary riflemen who had internalized both the hider's eye and the shooter's hand. And it was only the beginning of what was coming, because the American army was starting to build something the Germans had never really faced. A system of anti-sniper response that did not require any snipers of its own at all. When that system was in place, the German sharpshooter in the West stopped being a threat and started being a liability. The German high command could not afford to keep committing them to the fight. For the German sniper, this changed everything. The game they'd trained for no longer existed. By August of 1944, something is shifting in the paper record that survives on the German side, too. Post-war interrogations, memoirs, and after-action reports from Wehrmacht units in the West describe a change in the way sharpshooting was working. In the East, a good marksman could operate for weeks or months from behind the same set of positions, hunting Soviet forward observers and machine gun crews, sometimes doubling back into positions he had used before. In the West, positions became disposable. Fire once, twice at most, and get out. Because if the Americans located you, if they even suspected the general direction you were in, what came back was not a return shot. What came back was reconnaissance by fire. The unit expended rounds, sometimes a lot of rounds. And if that fire produced any response, a movement, a return shot, a snap twig, the situation escalated instantly. Mortars, artillery, machine guns, the entire weight of an American infantry company brought down on a single position. By the fall of 1944, entering the woods of the Hürtgen Forest and the border battles around Aachen, German shooters in the West were surviving less time in the field than any specialists on the German side. Historian Dr. Robert Rush, whose work on the 22nd Infantry Regiment in the Hürtgen Forest is definitive, documented an 87% casualty rate for that regiment on its first day of fighting. Every man on both sides of that fight was dying. But the marksmen on the German side were dying disproportionately. And they were often not dying to counter-snipers. They were dying to artillery. They were dying to mortar barrages that saturated their positions. They were dying because the Americans could not be baited into the classic sharpshooters duel. The German High Command, for its part, seems to have understood the problem in a language it could name. Interrogations of captured German shooters late in 1944 and into 1945 revealed a shift in deployment doctrine. Increasingly, snipers in the West were being pulled back to defensive positions inside built-up areas. Villages, towns, factory districts, where they could shoot from windows and disappear into cellars. The open country of the hedgerows, and later of the Ardennes and the Rhineland, had become a killing zone for the men trained to hunt in it. And then there was the other thing. The thing that spread by rumor through the Wehrmacht faster than any official communication ever did. If you were captured as a sniper by American troops, you often did not survive the walk to the rear. This part of the war has been documented carefully and quietly in the post-war academic literature. American historian Peter Schrijvers in The Crash of Ruin and Simon Mackenzie in his 1994 study of prisoner treatment both note that sharpshooters occupied a special category. Stephen Ambrose in Citizen Soldiers wrote plainly that GIs were less inclined to accord the honors of war to members of the SS, to those who surrendered too late, and to snipers. Osprey Publishing's Bolt Action Campaign Guide summarizes what the historical sources record without embellishment. There are many accounts of snipers being executed on capture, and just as many of snipers being shunned and socially outcast by soldiers of their own army. An aide to General Omar Bradley noted the general's position on the matter. Bradley, according to the aide's account, said he would not take action against anyone who decided to treat a captured sniper a little more roughly than they are being treated at present. This was not policy. This was a general looking away. American units that had lost men to a sharpshooter felt an anger that did not distinguish between rules of war and rules of survival. A sniper's target selection, deliberate, individual, personal, felt to the men on the receiving end of it like assassination rather than combat. And so from a purely mathematical perspective, the German specialist in the West faced a compound problem. His position was likely to be located by defensive-minded infantrymen who thought like hiders. It was likely to be saturated with fire before he could relocate, and if he did survive to surrender, he was likely to be killed anyway. We cannot know how many German shooters died in the West. The Wehrmacht's own casualty records did not distinguish snipers as a separate category with any consistency, and the post-war chaos destroyed many of the records that did exist. But we know some individual fates. Hetzenau himself was captured on the Eastern Front and spent 5 years in Soviet forced labor. A fate that at least did not leave him executed in a ditch. Allerberger, before his surrender to American forces, placed his beloved G-43 sniper rifle under the tracks of a Sturmgeschütz assault gun so it would not fall into Allied hands. His war ended in 1945. His memoir, published decades later under a pseudonym, tells the story of a man who had killed for years and could not bring himself to speak plainly about who he had been. There is one other haunting piece of evidence, quiet in the archives, from the second half of 1944 and into 1945. Young German snipers, poorly trained, sent into the fight in the West as the Reich ran out of experienced men. They were often teenagers from Hitler Youth backgrounds. When they were compromised, they did not do what an experienced Eastern Front veteran would have done, which was slip out and try to survive to fight again. They stayed in their positions and shot until they ran out of ammunition or were killed. The Americans, in their gallows humor, called them the suicide boys. They disrupted operations badly. But they died in place at 18 or 19 years old, in the corners of forests they'd never seen before that week. The veterans were gone. The children were dying. And the farm boys from Kentucky were still shooting. The answer is something no training manual ever wrote down. It's something the Germans never could have taught because they never could have imagined it. The verdict on this small, forgotten piece of the war is this. The Germans built the best sniper program of the Second World War. It was the product of years of Eastern Front experience, disciplined pedagogy, and a national tradition of marksmanship that reached back centuries. In the East, it worked brilliantly. In the West, it collided with something that was not a sniper program at all. It collided with a national reflex embedded in millions of ordinary men, a way of thinking about ground that came not from military training, but from a lifetime of reading terrain from the perspective of the thing being hunted. Not where do I shoot from, but where would someone be if they were trying to shoot me? Not the hunter's question, the hider's question. The Americans who ended the German sniper program were not specialists. They were not the product of a formal school. They were rural boys who had spent their childhoods being still, watching deer, walking creek beds, learning to disappear into the landscape because that was how you put food on the table. They were farmers who thought like farmers, defenders who thought like defenders. And that mindset, applied by enough ordinary men to enough hedgerows, added up to something the German training had never prepared anyone to face. What the Germans never understood was that they had trained to defeat a hunter. They had trained to win a duel against another specialist who thought the same way they did. But the Americans were not sending hunters. They were sending farmers. And you don't defeat a farmer by outshooting him. You defeat him by taking his ground. And if you try to hold ground against a farmer, he will close the gate, mark the boundaries, and make your position untenable. The German sniper, the finest marksman in the finest army of the 20th century, died in a hedgerow to a farm boy who was thinking about the shape of the ground the way his father had taught him to think about it when they hunted deer together in a Kentucky autumn. The sniper from the farmhouse window at the beginning of this story, he was found the next morning. No bullet wounds. He'd been killed by a mortar fragment. He never saw the man who called in the coordinates. He never knew it was a farm boy from Kentucky who had simply looked at that farmhouse and asked, "Where would I hide?" The men who defeated all of them are, in most cases, unknown. There is no monument to the American infantry captain who taught his platoon to fire at every shadowy hedgerow before crossing an open field. There is no textbook chapter on the anonymous farm boy from Kentucky or Iowa or Vermont who looked at a Norman tree line and asked the question no German instructor had ever anticipated. But the lesson is not just about sharpshooting. It is about the whole architecture of war. Armies build training around the enemies they expect. And the enemies they expect are usually enemies that look like themselves. The Germans expected snipers. They got a country of hiders. And the hiders won. This is what the Germans never understood about the men killing them. It's what no training manual ever wrote down. It's what they never could have taught because they never could have imagined it. The Germans had spent years perfecting a mirror. And then they looked into it and saw an enemy that was not there. While behind them, in the hedgerows, a country of farmers was closing the gate. If this forensic look at a forgotten piece of the Second World War meant something to you, the men who defeated the German sniper program are, in most cases, unknown. There is no monument to the American infantry captain who taught his platoon to fire at every shadowy hedgerow before crossing an open field. There is no textbook chapter on the anonymous farm boy from Kentucky or Iowa or Vermont who looked at a Norman tree line and asked the question no German instructor had ever anticipated. The German veterans who survived, men like Allerberger, who destroyed his beloved rifle rather than let it fall into Allied hands, carried the weight of what they had done for the rest of their lives. His memoir, published decades later under a pseudonym, tells the story of a man who had killed for years and could not bring himself to speak plainly about who he had been. The teenagers who died in the Hurtgen forest and the Ardennes, the suicide boys, never got the chance to grow old with their memories. They died at 18 and 19, in forests they'd never seen before that week, for a cause that was already lost. And the farm boys who ended it all, the Register, the Michael, the thousands of anonymous men who never called themselves snipers, went home. They went back to their farms, their small towns, their dirt roads. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't give interviews. They just lived their lives, knowing that in a war full of specialists, they had done something no specialist could have done. They had defended the ground. If you had a father or grandfather who fought in this campaign, if you have a name, a unit, a story, please share it in the comments. What unit did they serve with? Where did they fight? Every name spoken keeps that generation from disappearing into a number. Every story told makes sure that what they did is not forgotten. The farm boys who never called themselves snipers, but who nonetheless ended one of the deadliest sharpshooting programs in history, deserve to be seen for what they actually did. They didn't hunt the hunters. They defended the ground. And in defending it, they won. If this forensic look at a forgotten piece of the Second World War meant something to you, hit the like button. It helps the channel reach the people who care about getting the history right. Not the version that came out of the sniper schools, but the version that came out of the fields. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. The men who died in those hedgerows on both sides deserve to be understood, not just remembered as numbers. The Germans expected hunters. They got a country of hiders. And the hiders won.